Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Catherine Mazzone here on behalf of MojoStreaming. And joining me, we have two very distinguished guests. They're filmmakers, Lynn Santer and James Ganiere. As you both know, this has been a very contentious topic. It's been a very relevant topic, the topic of trophy hunting in recent years, actually for a while, but it's garnered attention outside of, I guess, the wildlife advocacy, wildlife conservation community more recently with the ideas of potentially banning the imports of trophy animals into the United Kingdom. I think it's important, and I think MojoStreaming thinks it's important to continue this discussion. So,
yeah, well, I think as a result of the conversation that happened earlier, the debate that happened earlier today, I think there's a tendency to muddy the waters by including data or statements that are kind of broad sweeping and using one example, and it can be very misleading on there. But when you start to kind of unpack it and pull it apart, you start to realize, well, that was misleading. All these things they have nothing to do with this. You've grouped in things with the argument that literally shouldn't be a part of the argument. Or you've grouped in data that doesn't belong with the data that we're really discussing on there. And I've seen this happen too much. And so for the general public, which I would consider myself, it's confusing and misleading, and you're led to think that everything is fine or okay, or the opposite. But in the end, it causes confusion. And the number one result from confusion is inaction. When people are confused about what to do, they don't do anything. And that's just how our human mind works on there. It works with it when voting. It works with it when purchasing a product. When we're confused, we just don't buy. We wait and stand back. And that's what we want to eliminate.
All of that is true. Certainly there is confusion. And I mean, one of the points that I think it is important to make is that this is an extremely complex issue.
Yes.
I mean, the man in the street, you're either on one side or the other. Trophy hunting is good and fun, or trophy hunting is bad and it should be stopped. It just is not that simple. There is not an on-off switch to this. There's layer upon layer of complexity. It's very political. There's enormous money involved. It is not a single piece of legislation. It is many pieces of legislation. It is not a single territory of the world. It is many territories of the world. So you can't just say, all right, let's ban it. That's it. Good. Off. And it's over now. It just is not that simple. It would be lovely if it was, but that is not the reality.
Yeah. And I think it's childish to just look at it from a simplistic view and not unpack it and look at all the details, all the factors, and all the things that are being affected. You just can't do that. Anytime we've seen legislation that does that, there's a horrible ripple effect that happens. And we've seen that here with other laws where, by passing certain laws, all of a sudden, forests couldn't be thinned. When forests couldn't be thinned, then all of a sudden forest fires started happening more frequent and longer periods and hotter and destroying more. And the cost of fighting them went up. It was just rippled out of control on there. And then all our lumber prices started shooting through the roof because, then we had to ship it in from overseas. The same thing will happen with any subject if you don't unpack it and look at the ripple and all the forces at play.
I think this is a perfect preface to our conversation today, because I think that a lot of what your intention is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of clearing the waters, making sure that the message is succinct and that it's directed. It's easy for the common man to understand. Lynn, I kind of want to ask you a few questions to start because you've been a wildlife advocate ever since you were in the single digits. There was no confusion on your part, right?
No, there was never any confusion on my part. I started writing stories while I was still, well, virtually out of the cot with crayons on my bedroom wall. And my parents very quickly decided that they needed to buy me endless reams of paper and pens because telling stories and bringing truth out was just in me. And my father was, perhaps ironically, originally a research chemist and ultimately rose to be chairman of an international pharmaceutical company and spent a lot of time in Africa, both on medical research and then subsequently as managing director of an international company. But his passion was wildlife photography. So he would travel over there with a very small suitcase of clothes and a very enormous suitcase of Super 8 film equipment, as it was in those days. And he actually built a full-blown cinema in the attic of our London home. And he would come home and he would edit up with the music and the sound effects and the narration, David Attenborough style, films of his trips to Africa, which I would then show to my little friends when I was in single digits, that my daddy made. And, films of the Dark Continent were mesmerizing to anybody, particularly when your daddy made them. And you're watching them in the attic cinema of your London home with your little friends. There's just a bigger magic about it. So you're right. I went on to work with the PDSA, which was the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, at about the age of 9. And I won every award that there was to win, to the point where they created a new one just for me. And then I started a group when I was 12 called the London Zoological Society, which was awareness about wildlife for my school friends. And it went on from there, and the passion began in the attic cinema of the London home with my father's films. But when I grew up to be an adult, I went everywhere around the world almost, except Africa, because the magic that had built up in my mind from those early childhood films of my father's, my adult mind told me couldn't be as good, and I didn't want to go and burst the bubble. I just thought Africa can never be what my childhood mind has conjured it up to be. So I'm just going to leave that illusion intact. Until one day there were a variety of circumstances that led to me taking the plunge and going. And extraordinary events occurred. I ended up piloting. I was taking flying lessons, but I wasn't a qualified pilot yet. I ended up piloting a Cessna Caravan, a 12-seater, over the Kruger as soon as I landed. Extraordinary circumstances led to all this. I was the only guest in Ngala, which is a private game reserve on the boundary of the Kruger. I had 80 staff, 15,000 hectares, and all the animals of Africa to myself, which is what my vision of Africa my vision of heaven looks like. That was my first time ever in Africa. So far from bursting the bubble, it exceeded it. And when I went back from that trip, it was when I first met Virginia McKenna of Born Free, Will's mum. And we've been lifelong friends ever since. And that was before even the Land of the Free story began.
I saw that you, James, describe yourself as a consummate entrepreneur. Would you say that you're an entrepreneur above all else?
Probably, but I still find that word kind of is very limiting. It's, above all else, I think probably for this conversation, I'm a steward of the world and a steward of mankind. And that really, goes to bettering this world and bettering my fellow man and adding to, what we have, and helping others to add to what we have and go from there. I'm very solutions based. I found very quickly that I was really good at kind of the analytical engineering type of mind, but also on the opposite end, really creative. And that other people weren't like that. That I thought that everybody was like me. And usually that's how you are when you're growing up. You think, oh, everybody's just like me. They think like me and everything. And I realized really quick that other people didn't think like me. They thought maybe in parts like me, but then they were missing all this other stuff. And so communication, I found sometimes it was a little bit hard to communicate. So I learned how to communicate with all different types of people. And I found that that was extremely fascinating. And so, you know, I really kind of studied more on that because I wanted to communicate more than anything else. The hardest thing for me to do was communicate because I was severely dyslexic. And so I didn't learn to read until almost, 16 on there. And it was still slow and belabored. And it wasn't until, I was in college that got much better on there. And then after that, was able to really thrive. So the only way I could absorb information was video and audio. So conversations with people. So my love of film and cinema came into play on there. And that also caused me to study and understand things because I lived in a world that did not accept people who couldn't read. I lived in a world that dyslexia was unknown for the most part to everyone, including doctors. And that if you had dyslexia, regardless of how smart you were considered or told, like I was many times, that I was retarded, that I had these mental issues, deficiencies. So all this was locked inside of me. So communication was one of the most important things for me. And as such, I also learned to study things because I had to mask everything and portray that I could read and understand everything without reading anything. So you learn very well to pick up on cues and pick up on things in conversations, and that really quick. And as such, that was probably one of the best skill sets for me to learn as a director, to understand human nature, understand people, understand everything around you from a 360 view, and be able to portray that clearly to all different types of people and the different ways they think and the different ways they learn and the different way they understand things. So that's a long-winded answer on whether I consider myself an entrepreneur or not.
That's a gift. Let me just finish your sentence. That's a gift.
When I saw Lynn, she stood out from everybody else that was pitching me over a 2-day period. She stood out. And I saw just the gem that she is, even if anybody else didn't see it. I saw it and I knew what it could be on there. And that's kind of how this whole thing had begun.
The circumstances of our meeting were very high pressure, very fast moving, very intense. And on my side of the desk, you tended to be much more focused in trying to say what you wanted to say as succinctly and powerfully and quickly as possible. So yes, I did see something in him, but not what I see now.
Yeah.
Way. I guess what he saw in me, because I was a bit of an explosion at the very moment of our first meeting, but very soon after, because we followed up that first meeting very quickly and we connected immediately, didn't we, James? It was an instant thing, really.
Yeah, we connected immediately, and you got to realize we had 5 minutes. That was it.
So break this down for me. This was a 5-minute pitching session or something?
It was a 5-minute pitch. So from like beginning in the morning, I think we started at like 9 a.m. on there. So 9 a.m. and then we had like a half hour lunch, and then we went all the way to the evening. And then it was the same thing the next day. And so I had 1 5-minute after the next 5-minute after the next 5-minute. Like as soon as we hit 5 minutes, there was a next person standing right behind them to sit down and pitch. So we went through, it was me, and I was just going through all these pitches, and Lynn sat down as one of these 5 minutes and stood out from everybody else. And so I was very focused because I needed to get to know her. Like at first she tried to pitch me the first thing. I was like, no, I need to know who you are. I need to know who I'm talking to. And so she started telling me who she is, and I was like, oh, I like her.
Do you remember what she said?
Oh, it was just the way that she carries herself. Like all you have to do is meet Lynn for 5 minutes and you know who she is. With that, it was, I knew very quickly, and then I had to roll into, okay, because that usually takes about 2-3 minutes to really understand who somebody is and connect with them. And then it's like, now I need you to tell me about your projects, project or projects. And so she would bring up each one. I was like, oh yeah, not so much, not as commercial. Okay, yeah. And then it's like, boom, she brought up one. I was like, boom, that's it. That's commercial. That's the one I'm interested in.
Which wasn't this one.
No, it wasn't this one, because this one I just saw there was so much work to be done, and it is such an uphill battle in all of this stuff. And I was like, no, on there.
When did you figure out what exactly that project was going to be, and how did you decide on it?
Well, everything's about timing.
Yes.
It happened to be the year that we met, was the year Cecil the lion died, was killed, was murdered. Now, I had been on the journey of Land of the Free since 2001. Cecil died and James and I met in 2015. So I had already been on this journey and hit brick walls and received death threats and been through, I can't tell you, dramas, and almost given up. But it was Cecil's death that gave the whole movement of banning trophy hunting new impetus. So while James was excited, I got him, to the point where he couldn't unsee things. And because he cares, and because he also has a huge heart, a sense of integrity and justice, he couldn't turn away. And we ended up going to the Emmys together that year. And I had a special outfit made for me before I'd left Australia by a designer friend of mine here, London, who specializes in wildlife art on her designs, of Cecil, with huge letters around Cecil saying in memory of Cecil. And of course, it was all over the news at that point in time. And I thought the Emmys was a pretty good place to make a statement. And I have to tell you, that dress was more photographed than the Emmy winners. It certainly did make a statement. And there's a photograph of James and I in front of an enormous Emmy statue with me. It's a caftan, so I was holding out my arms so you could really see the whole thing. And I think it's one of my favorite photos of all time, because it says everything about James and I. It had the Hollywood, it had the glamour, it had the issue, it had, wildlife activism and advocacy on it. Everything about who we are is in that one image.
I'm wondering if there is a sort of installment plan that we can expect. Is there we are taking this journey with you, Lynn, and through your work, James, we're able to understand and see the beauty and the strife.
All right, well, let me try to...
Here, let me jump in really quick. So the interesting thing is, early on, we had some great stuff going as like a narrative feature. And then at one point, we had some devastating news after some great news. And that's usually how things happen. It's like one follows the other, where there's devastating news and then great news, or great news and then devastating. And Lynn called me up and she said, "It's over." And I'm like, "No, it isn't." She's like, "What do you mean it's not over?" And I'm like, "Well, this is what we can do." And I started to lay out a plan where we could do a short documentary and then release something longer and then go from there and have other things coming one after another and really do something that is kind of bootstrapped, just grassroots way of doing it, and have it build on itself on there to really bring this message out to the world. And I couldn't be more thrilled with, you know, the progress we've been able to make with the resources that we had in the middle of the pandemic, not being able to travel to anywhere in the world, but still having to shoot footage there. And having Lynn as this incredible partner who, you know, she will go and she'll set up everything and get it all going, you know, and I'm strategizing how to do it and she's going and doing it. It's really this kind of fun partnership that we have that is highly effective and just achieve things that neither of us would have achieved on our own. And that's really the magic of it. And so, yes, to answer the question, I know I went way off topic, but it's really important to understand that, to understand how many things that are going to come out of this.
Yeah.
There are going to be many installments because that's what's really needed to make these changes globally on a permanent basis.
I mean, going back to 2001, you know, this began when I was organizing a simple, glitzy, you know, fundraiser, awareness raiser for big cat conservation. And my very good friend, Chippy Hedren, was coming out to Australia to front the event. Now, I received an email during the preparation for that, which changed my life forever, from a woman I had never heard of, from Zimbabwe, who was then the chief inspector with the Zimbabwe SPCA. And she had just managed to get an amendment to the Wildlife Act to ban the trophy hunting of endangered leopard with hounds, hounds that were trained with electric shock collars, which was another layer of cruelty, using live bait to lure the trophy animals, such as donkeys and goats, which was another layer of cruelty. And she had succeeded, and somebody within the department had given her the amendment with the words "Victory is ours" written across it, and there were great celebrations. And within days, Safari Club International had intervened, which is what they do and what they seem to think it is their God-given right to do. They interfere with the policies of foreign sovereign nations that those countries have seen fit to put in place to protect their endangered species, to protect their perceived right to go and slaughter, and often brutally, endangered species for pride, pleasure, and profit. Now, here was I working from a spare bedroom at the end of the earth on the Gold Coast of Australia, in the middle of organizing a big event with a Hollywood celebrity. And I received this email from this woman I didn't know in Zimbabwe and thought, what on earth could I do against? And the key signatories to another petition simultaneously at that time to Botswana were George Bush Sr., General Norman Schwarzkopf, Dan Quayle. I mean, you know, minor names like that. You know, Merrill couldn't afford to pay a phone bill, so we weren't joking when we called this a David and Goliath battle. But I was determined not to do what everybody else was going to do, which was to say it's shocking, have a cup of coffee and get on with their lives and forget it, because it was just too enormous. But what people must remember is the ocean is not a vast body of water. It is made up of an infinite number of individual drops, and we are those individual drops. And together we can create a tsunami. So way back then, in 2001, I went out and found myself, as one does if one lives in a James Bond film, some ex-Special Forces commandos, one of whom is still my friend to this day and appears in the film. And I said I'd like to plan a covert mission to expose the truth and get visual and documented evidence about what is really going on. And we had some interesting discussions about that. But I brought him on board. I said to Tippy, are you in? She said, absolutely. And, you know, there was risk and exposure for her. You know, she didn't hesitate for a second. And then I contacted Merrill and I said, look, you don't know me. I live in Australia. I'm bringing out this Hollywood movie star for this big event. I've hired this ex-Special Forces commando. I want to plan this covert mission to help you, you know, get your amendment active again. And if I bring you out to Australia at my expense, will you help us plan the whole thing? She must have thought I was on drugs. I thought I was on drugs. Anyway, that happened. And it was 5 years later before we got the first story out, because all sorts of things happened to try and stop us. During which time Meryl's twin brother was beaten to death. And this amazing reporter, Kirsty Lum, with the Nine Network in Australia, initially got the story out with Tippy, Meryl, and myself. Back then, we were the Three Musketeers. And we wrote a book, and I took that to Hollywood and went to launch it. And we actually sold an option to make the movie. And then outside influences interfered with that, and yada, yada, yada. And anyway, fast forward to 2015, James, we were then, still trying to make the narrative feature film. And then fast forward a few years, and this other moment happened when I said it was over, and James said, no, we're going to pivot to do the documentary thing. And that was when the multi-phase plan started to unroll, with the short documentary, the longer documentary, and so on. And ultimately, we will make the feature film, which will be fictionalized and include, all the normal Hollywoodisms in it, and probably a love triangle and all that good stuff that you have to see in a narrative feature film. Yes. The first short film really focused, and this was James's idea, on the psychology of the trophy hunter, and we got some very interesting contributors and some contributions on that aspect of it. The next one is really, really focusing, because the first one gave us such credibility and attention that we have obtained so much more for the second one that is really going to go into the deliberate and systematic disinformation campaigns by the trophy hunting industry, both to the public and to the policymakers, following evidence of the money trail, recording inside the evidentiary hearings of the House of Commons in London, which of course the Safari Club have recently auctioned the soul of a polar bear to raise funds to block that legislation going through. This is what they do, interfere with the policies of foreign sovereign nations, as though it is their right. And we are winning. I mean, there are a number of pieces of legislation or commercial policies that have already passed. There are more on the table. As I said, it isn't an on-off switch. It's an inch by inch, anything's a cinch. So there are many carriers that are now banning the shipment of parts. There is legislation on the table. We've got lobbyists in place all over the world. As we, the movement, when I say we, because we've got some amazing people all over the world now in this. It's not just a matter of stopping us now. It's too big. It's got a life of its own. And as I say somewhere in the film, yes, it's a David and Goliath battle, but let's not forget something. David won.
And on two of those points that Lynn pointed out, it is bringing so many people and organizations around the world that are very segmented all together on the subject, on a specific purpose on there. Because all the different organizations and folks around the world, they have different interests in what they're addressing and don't always work well with others or communicate with others in the state of themselves. But what we're really looking at doing is not just uniting all of those, but also clear information to the public for them to make their own decision so they know what's really going on. Which is why also the title of this one that Lynn and I discussed, this is land. The next one is Land of the Free Out of the Shadows. The first one was in the shadows. This is the stuff that was going on in the shadows. Now we're pulling it out of the shadows so that people can really see, be informed, and then make sure that these laws are appropriate for what our morality and beliefs are reflected today, because so many laws are way out of date, and just because you have a law and it's legal doesn't mean that it's morally right. We've experienced that throughout the ages, you know, and it takes a while for some of these laws to actually be in alignment with morality on there. So that's really kind of the purpose, you know, and the public more than ever connects with what we're doing. And there's more access to everybody as well. There's more people connected to the internet. And so it's harder to hide in shadows.
I'm wondering if you all see less of a challenge now that you've been able to kind of bring these organizations and reach the public. Are we going to have an easier time, you think, having a conversation about what we need to have a conversation about so that there can be real progress?
Easier than 20 years ago? Absolutely. Easier than 50 years ago? No doubt. So, I mean,
but it's not easy.
It's never easy, but it's in comparison. But accomplishing anything isn't easy. It takes work, and it takes people to really collect together to make something happen. And they were talking a little bit about that in the debate today. You know, people lay out a plan, they lay out a nominal cost that will solve these problems, but they're having trouble getting people to take action and pass that, which is kind of sad and ridiculous. And so there's always points at which things break down in the process.
It's easy from the point of view that there's a much greater public awareness, although the public aren't as aware as they think they are aware, and this next film will certainly do a lot to alleviate that particular problem.
It was a lot of folks that were watching the film. They thought the same thing that I did. I went on a safari with my father. He took me on a safari, a photo safari, and it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And never did I think, while I was experiencing that or after, that wouldn't be there for my children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren to experience themselves, these magnificent animals in the wild. Never crossed my mind. I thought for sure, it's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna make sure I bring my kids and make sure that. Now from that time to now, we've had animals that are completely extinct.
You know, it's easier from the point of view that there is more awareness, and we're doing more about the awareness, and public opinion is 1,000% on our side. You know, 80-90% of, you know, people in the street would be with us to ban trophy hunting and endangered species. But on the other side, while they're in the minority, they have the political muscle, they have the financial clout that dwarfs our side. So it's not easier in that respect because they're not going down without a fight.
I mean, myself personally, I thought before Lynn, I thought the Endangered Species Act covered all of this. Like, we have addressed this issue and it's done and we don't have to worry about it. People on our team thought that was the same thing. And we were having to explain it. The way that things are put out in the media or the way that they're politicized, there's so much misinformation that the public in general, if they understood the truth, there is no way they would stand for it. That's me. You know, for me, I see myself as the average person, the average citizen. And when I found out, I was like, goodness sakes, if everybody like me found out, that's like 80% of the United States would be like, whoa, we can all agree that if a species is endangered, we shouldn't be killing them.
We don't need to convince our side. We are never going to convince the other side. It's the 80% in the middle who are ambivalent and through no fault of their own ignorant that we need to make aware to make change. And as James said, there were people on our own team who still were calling it poaching, who were still not understanding that there is a difference between legal trophy hunting, legal trophy hunting, and illegal poaching, Although there is some crossover. Poachers are now getting some of their quarry out under the guise of it being legal trophy hunting. So there is a crossover, but they are different.
And each one of those team members, when the light bulb finally went on and they realized what we were talking about, wow, you could not just see it on them, you could see everything about their demeanor, everything changed instantly when they finally got what's really going on. And these are our team members.
So this 80 to 85%, how are you going to target them if they're ambivalent, first of all? And second of all, how is your film going to carry this message?
Part of me says you're going to have to wait to see it, because
That's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. I can wait. Can you give us a little tiny bit of a something, a
we're
niblet?
not just giving opinions, as to an extent we were in the first film. We have evidence now, rock solid, irrefutable evidence, printed evidence, visual evidence, covert footage from Africa, covert footage from within the United States. We have not, every pun intended, fired all our shots yet, by a long way.
But I think, kind of circling back to
How we're
something
going to use it now is geographic reach. I mean, which is what we did with the first one. Sorry, James.
Yeah, and I think just to circle back about some of the things that we already discussed and just kind of bring them up to this question is, number one, communicating things clearly. Here's what the facts are. The first one, yes, we had opinions, but we also covered facts and posed questions.
Yes.
Because we want the public to think about the questions we're asking and come to their own conclusions. Because nothing's going to happen if you just tell somebody to do something. Like, that is not what this is about. This is about information that is obscure or hidden, and to provide it, and then for them to make their own conclusion and decision as to what they should do and their action. And overwhelmingly, the responses that we have gotten are just incredible. But this next one really dives into the facts on there, so that people are highly informed of what's going on. And
when we talk about people, it's public opinion on the one hand, which is obviously geographical reach of the film and the numbers that it reaches. But it's also to lobbyists involved in the movement and the policy makers, because the other side is trying to get the other side's version of facts, or we'll call them facts, out there. So it's important for our film to get into the hands of the policymakers as well as the people, if I can make that distinction.
And that's the other kind of main distinction that I think we probably ought to make here is we're really focused on the endangered species. We're not talking about subsistence hunting. We're not talking about, controlling out of control populations. We're not addressing or talking about that. We're talking about endangered species that are on the brink of going extinct. That's what we're talking about, because 80% of the people can agree on that. They can come to a consensus on, hey, it would be really nice to have these around for future generations. What can we do to make sure that that actually happens, and that we're proper stewards of the world we live in? Because we've had past generations that have trashed the world chemically, as well as in many other manners. And we're dealing with the ramifications from that. And I think our generations coming up today realize that this world, you have to be a steward of it. It's not just exploitation of any asset or any resource that is available to you. It's a whole different mindset.
We're not masters of the world, we're custodians of it.
Yes.
I want to thank you both for spending the time to talk about not only your films, but how your life has influenced your work.